So I was raised in something adjacent to Christianity, but a key factor was it was missing its metaphysics. My grandfather was a Baptist minister. My father rebelled in the early 1970s, turning towards leftist politics. Now, it's important to note that leftism and Christianity overlap in certain ways. Concern for the poor, equality in some ways, skepticism of wealth and power, and belief in the power of words, ideas, and ultimately moral persuasion. My dad, as time went on, increasingly tried to hold Christian ethics without mooring them with Christian metaphysics. So I didn't really grow up an atheist per se. I grew up in a kind of Christian adjacent, I would say a kind of Christian heresy. But there was no sense of sin, there was no sense of the soul, and no real sense of the supernatural. Section 2, the hidden cost of removing the soul. See, when you remove metaphysics, everything collapses into politics in the body. There's no doctrine of original sin, there's no Satan, so there's no real personal evil. Evil becomes collective, and individuals aren't really held morally accountable in a deep way. Moral responsibility gets conflated with group identity, and this is what happened in my household. We were woke before there was woke. So it was all about racism and sexism and classism and homophobia. And my mother, so without any of these underpinnings that I described, my mother had natural anxiety, but she understood medicine. She was a nurse. But with her materialism, the body, my body, but also her body, our family's body, became her ultimate concern. And so health and safety and nutrition married her hypervigilance, and it created like a constant fear of threats and toxins and danger. When you don't believe in the soul, all anxiety gets pushed into the body, and that can create a permanent sense of fear. Section 3, pacifism in a violent world. Core ID, naive moral purity becomes dangerous when reality is brutal. See, my parents implicitly taught me that violence itself is inherently evil, and that there's no real moral complexity to violence, and therefore no framework for defensive violence. I grew up in poor and working class neighborhoods in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Black and Puerto Rican, and then in Upper Darby, right on the border of West Philadelphia, in Italian and Irish Catholic neighborhoods with smatterings of Asians, Asian Indians, and East Asians. And the people around me, whether they were adults, children, or adolescents, they had absolutely no hesitation in using force and violence. I was expected to be some sort of secular humanist moral missionary amongst this working class chaos. And so Christianity traditionally sees violence as a tool that can be used by evil, but technically it can be used by good too. It is not identical with evil itself. And so ultimately I wasn't taught how to survive. I was taught how to try to be morally pure. What I later learned, I learned to be under works. And that, in a technical sense of the word, was traumatic. Section 4, I became pagan eventually, growing up in my adolescence, without really knowing it. The core idea here is that everyone worships something. We all just have different gods. My gods, increasingly, as I became a teenager, were masculinity, and I found that in athletes, in hip-hop, and eventually in criminals, and there'd be sometimes overlap. Marxism, I embraced that, understandably, because my parents were Marxists. And that became the totalitarian explanation, the total, the ultimate worldview. And then I found drugs and alcohol in my later teen years, and that became a source of power. Substances helped me create and maintain a kind of social gravity, attracting men, women. I began to have substances be part of how I established erotic power. I got relationships and tried to keep relationships. Ultimately, all this was a form of control. I still really strongly believed in knowledge in my mind, but it was unmoored from anything. So knowledge and the mind became idols and things I worshipped. And so ultimately, I didn't stop worshiping. I just started worshiping a variety of things and didn't understand I was worshiping them. Section 5. After using substances for about 10 years and being wild and partying, I did get 2 college degrees. I had a daughter. I eventually got clean and sober. And in this way, Christianity found me before I was able to name it. I never touched substances again after getting clean at age 28. but I found something both immanent and transcendent in NA, like a sense of confession in the fourth and fifth steps in steps 8 and 9, service to others, the use of prayer and meditation, the idea that writing could be powerful, and the fellowship, the community. These were all both involved transcendent principles, but they were immanent in the sense that they were embodied and they were very local and personal, and I could experience them. And I didn't call that Jesus, but I now in retrospect can see that the logos, like the idea that there's intelligibility, there's order to be found, there's healthy order that we can, or ability to order things that we can kind of connect to and use. Like it's a power greater than us that we can manifest. So we can create ordered structures internally and externally. And through the 12 steps and the other features of the 12-step program, I found that power. So I found Christ structurally before I found him personally. Section 6. So I found evangelical Christianity pretty early on, but it couldn't hold me. And in that, I sensed a moral and psychological problem before I could articulate it. And the first way I understood this is I was uncomfortable with the language of being saved. I felt like this was something that I later understood through this individual named Rollo May, who wrote a book called Power and Innocence. He was an existential psychologist, wrote this book in the 60s. And he talked about how human beings are uncomfortable with power because when you acknowledge your power, you are no longer innocent. You have the power to help, but also to hurt. And he didn't mean to pick on like evangelical Christians or Christians who use the saved concept, but he just pointed them out. I don't mean to pick on them either, but being saved doesn't necessarily have to do this, but sometimes it functions in this way to like abdicate power and maintain innocence. And so early on in recovery, I saw evangelical Christianity, largely, that's a large umbrella term, and I saw people using that saved language, and I intuited something that Rollo May articulated, and I was uncomfortable with. And so in rejecting kind of like that kind of Christianity, although I did do the whole, I believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, I did the whole verbal born again thing. It didn't hold and take in me. Like I didn't follow through with community and Bible reading and going to church routinely. Some of us, I didn't want to give up my lifestyle, aspects of my lifestyle, but I think another part of it was the fact that evangelical Christianity posed these kind of obstacles for me. It's nothing like inherent in evangelical Christianity, but the way that it functioned in relationship to me. Section 7. So after many years of being kind of on the outskirts, like Christianity adjacent, I've experienced a midlife crisis that involved first physical symptoms. Now, it was ultimately a spiritual, mental, it was a holistic crisis, but it first manifested in the body, and then that exposed the fact that I was essentially making an idol out of my body. And this, in a way, was my final idol, and it was the final idol that failed. So I lost bodily control. I used to be able to abuse my body and use my body as a mediator for pleasure and pain avoidance and control, but I could no longer do that without increasing discomfort. So some of my coping skills were denied me. And I had faced death as a younger person. Like hallucinogens seemed to help. And it wasn't just that I had like what they would call like beer balls, that I had like false courage from substances. I faced death when I wasn't on substances, but the whole lifestyle, the whole being young and adrenalized and full of testosterone, and also being able to manage the experience of coming close to death, like feel good after the threat of death or feel good up until death. That was a totally different relationship to death, to one where I felt like my body could be breaking down and failing. And so I'd be not only having to face death, but face it without control and without the ability to manage the physical pain that's involved. In the middle of that, my father died, and we found out my mother had already been gone. That's another story. I don't have time to get into that. And so I became isolated because some of my relationships weren't durable enough. I had grief. I had shame. I had, the health system that has toxicity in it, and my workplace there was toxicity. And so ultimately, I didn't lose my health. I lost the ability to use my body and the physical as my ultimate idol. And so when my body stopped cooperating, it's essentially my worldview sort of collapsed. So Section 8, talk about progressive churches. So I, along the way, before even all this happened, I had explored different mainline Protestant churches. And so they unfortunately reminded me of my religion growing up, which wasn't religion per se, but it was leftism. And they created these kind of moral binaries where group identity, again, sort of what I was taught as a young person, conferred moral status. And in this very binary, primitive moral system that I saw being espoused and promoted in these mainline Protestant churches I visited, were that the perpetrators, essentially white men or white people, it could be broken down in multiple ways, but the perpetrator classes, they had no rights, honestly, in this worldview, or minimal rights, or their rights were abrogated in favor of victims' rights. And on the other side, victims had no victim classes, that the people that the white male cis people would oppress, they had no real duties, or to put it more charitably, their duties were minimal at best. And so in that, I didn't find real Christianity. I just saw politics wearing the garments of it. And so section 9, what I found in Catholicism. So eventually, after trying a couple evangelical churches that they didn't, for multiple reasons, they felt too insular. I was still involved in the 12-step program. I was exposed to lots of different types of people. And I'm not judging them, because I think sometimes evangelical Christians, they're trying to protect themselves, similar to how people in the program don't want to be around people that are using drugs or alcohol. It's like they created their own little insular communities, but that wasn't the way I was outward facing. Like, I had guys I sponsored, my work, like I was out there living certain values out in the world, and to be cut off from that didn't feel organic or right or correct for me. And so that was one of the reasons. And they were, in many ways, they put Christianity first. I give them that credit, but they were right-wing in their political orientation. And especially around issues of like homosexuality, bisexuality, that I believe that many of the evangelical Christians were being honest when they said that they loved the sinner but hated the sin. But I had seen too much worship of masculinity and brutality and hatred of the other in my upbringing to believe that it wasn't also sometimes present in right-wing Christian churches. And so if they had done some moral accounting around that, I would have been more comfortable. But they didn't feel like they had to do any moral accounting. They believed that all they had to do was say, well, I would never gay bash. I would never discriminate against somebody. I would never call somebody effeminate or like put them down, which is all things that happened to me, by the way, growing up. I would never do any of that. I just don't like the lifestyle. Well, maybe you wouldn't, but it's a valid critique whether or not like there are still these energies that other people will use. And so right-wing Christianity does not offer a critique that I've ever heard of, let's say, pagan homophobia. And so that's just one reason of many. And so under Catholicism, I found I had already intuited this in brushes with Catholicism. My mother had talked about it. My mother had said, despite being atheistic, had sent my niece to a Catholic elementary school. I'm so extraordinarily autodidactic and well-read that I just couldn't help but encounter like Jesuit teachings and the presence of Catholic hospitals, like the first abolitionists for universal manumission, universal anti-slavery voices, although they were actually technically excommunicated for this by a corrupt or corrupted Vatican back in the 1500s. They were Catholic priests. And so and even I had like semi-supernatural events involving St. Anthony and lost things. And so I had all these touch points with Catholicism over the years where the morality, the social aspect, and the positioning, the ability to position like the search for knowledge, even science, being erudite and intellectual, all of that felt like it could be situated in a Catholic framework, whereas it felt like it was more in tension with some of the right wing or even the left wing milieus I was in. And so I got exposed to social teaching without the identity ideology. A sense of metaphysics was there. The soul and body are united, as far as I can tell. We have this concept of subsidiarity, which I don't have time to get into, but I was still a political animal, and so the politics were important. And so I wanted to be able to salvage and redeem some of my parents' orientation towards the other, towards caring about working people, caring about poor people, caring about, in some shape, form, or fashion, for groups who are marginalized and disadvantaged, without it becoming this identity politics. And so I saw in the Catholic framework, charity without utopianism, justice without dehumanizing the so-called oppressors, and subsidiarity, again, to go back to that, it's this idea that, politically speaking, local entities are best served local areas. And so that really helped me because, again, I have this political sense of the world. It's this idea that we exist in these kind of like Russian dolls, like all the way up to like higher order things, whereas most political people are battling at the highest level and they're neglecting the local. It's like you first should focus on the local, whether it's political or morally, like your own backyard type thinking. And then I found, call it sacramental realism. And so the real presence, like, I don't know when to use the post-enlightenment language of science versus not science, materialism versus non-materialism, because I think in the Catholic framework that is actually transcended. It precedes that way of seeing the world. But if I'm to retain some of the language because I live in this culture, I would say I experience in the Mass, being Catholic and having gone through some of the sacraments that are available to me, I felt the real presence of the Trinity. And liturgy is embodied worship. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel on this, because there's been lots of, especially in the Orthodox space, in the alternative media space, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau have talked about like the embodiment in liturgy. There's beauty in Catholic churches. Protestant churches, for lots of historical reasons, iconoclasm, et cetera, don't want to belabor that point, they're less beautiful. And there's movement, and there's the ultimate like holy silence. And so I guess the takeaway from all that would be, I found Catholicism, and Catholicism didn't ask me to abandon my reason, didn't abandon entirely my politics or psychology. It simply asked me to subordinate and situate them in a larger hierarchy with the Trinity on top. And so maybe why do I stay Catholic? So the core idea here might be I have transformation. I experienced and continue to experience transformation without coercion. And there's not as much personality-driven worship that I see in Protestant churches, and I don't want to belabor that point, but there's historical reasons for that. They tried to get the priest out of the way, but then they inserted this pastor became a very personality-driven force in these local churches, and his sermon became very powerful. And I feel like in lots of Protestant spaces, the pastor and his sermon, or her sermon, that was rare, often felt like they weren't in the way. I felt like they were coming up and trying to probe me at these churches for doctrinal purity, or just they wanted to know where I was at because they were interested in me joining, but they had like terms that you had to like intellectually adhere to certain things in order to join. So they wanted to kind of know, because they were kind of looking for more members, but they didn't want to push it. They were trying to be hospitable, but it became this dance where I was like, almost felt like I was being interviewed. And like, I don't want to be interviewed at church. I go to a Bible study now, and I've had like collisions with some of the Protestants there, because they're almost all Protestants, but it's on equal terms. We're equal. I've had to fight for equality in this group because some men there have tried to act like they were like the elder statesmen, and they have more time as official Christians than me, but they don't have as much experience or knowledge of religion and Christianity in general than I do. Maybe more technically about the Bible, but not about other things. But the point is, I contended that, but it's a Bible study. There's no clear authority being conferred on these people, but in Protestant churches, it's being conferred. When I go to Catholic Mass, I don't have the priest coming up to me and trying to impose. And again, I want to be charitable. They're not directly doing this, but their worldview, their ethics seems to necessarily, without them even trying to, seems to be imposing. And I don't want that. I want to experience God. I don't want anything in the way between me and God. And so Catholic Mass, I connect with God. And then the final, the most important thing are that I work in social work. I have associates in behavioral science. I've been in the drug and alcohol treatment adjacent world. I'm very in my own therapy. I have the therapeutic language down. I have the scientific language around trauma and the way the brain works down. And I don't have to abandon any of that in Catholicism. That can exist in those frameworks. And these material explanations, for lack of a better word, don't have to threaten faith, as long as I understand there's a hierarchy. And so here's the pat little conclusion. I feel like Christianity, but Catholicism in particular, gave me a way to suffer without undue despair, act without too much hatred, and live ultimately without worshiping the idols of myself.